He ate their sins. Then, they pretended he didn't exist. When someone died in rural Britain, the family didn't call a priest first. They sent for him, a man who lived alone at the edge of the village, who nobody spoke to, who children were told to avoid, who had not shared a meal with another person in years. He arrived, sat beside the body, and ate the food placed on it: bread, salt, and sometimes ale. Then he accepted a small coin, stood up, and left. And everyone in that room understood that he had just taken the dead person's sins into his own body, so they wouldn't have to carry them into the next life. This was the sin eater, and this was considered completely normal. To understand why this job existed, you have to understand what sin meant to ordinary people in medieval and early modern Britain. This wasn't abstract theology reserved for scholars and clergy. Sin was a practical, daily concern with real consequences that extended beyond death. The church taught that a person who died with unconfessed sins on their soul faced serious risk in the afterlife. Purgatory, at minimum, something considerably worse, if the sins were severe enough. For a dying person who had no time to confess, or who had committed acts they were too ashamed to say aloud to a priest, or who simply died without warning, this created a genuine, terrifying problem for the people who loved them. They needed a solution. They found one. The concept of transferring spiritual burden from one person to another already existed in religious tradition. The scapegoat of the Old Testament carried the sins of the community into the wilderness. The logic was familiar enough that adapting it to individual death made a kind of intuitive sense to communities that thought in these terms every day. Someone would absorb the dead person's sins by consuming food that had been in contact with the body. The food was the transfer mechanism. The eating made it binding. The ritual itself was simple and consistent across the regions where it was practiced. A plate was prepared, usually containing bread and salt, occasionally ale or another drink. This was placed directly on the body or passed over it. The sin eater was summoned and given the food. He ate it in full view of the family, deliberately and completely. There was no partial consumption, no symbolic gesture. The act had to be real and complete for the ritual to be considered valid. When he finished, he was given his payment. The standard fee across most documented accounts was 6 pence, sometimes less, occasionally slightly more if the family was wealthier or the deceased was considered particularly sinful. Then he left. The practice was documented most consistently in Wales, Shropshire, and the border counties of England, though accounts exist from Scotland, Ireland, and parts of the English Midlands as well. It persisted from at least the 17th century through the early 20th century in some rural areas, long after the official church had formally condemned it as superstition. Local clergy were aware it continued. In many cases, they tolerated it quietly, understanding that for families without access to a priest at the moment of death, the ritual provided something the church itself could not always guarantee: a specific, immediate, practical answer to a fear that doctrine created but could not always resolve in time. The sin eater existed because the system needed him to exist, and the system made sure he paid for it. Now, here's what accepting this job actually meant for the rest of your life. The moment a person became the sin eater, they stepped permanently outside the boundaries of normal social life in their community. This was not informal awkwardness. It was a structured, understood, community-wide arrangement that everyone participated in maintaining. They were not invited to share meals with others, because sharing food with someone who had ritually absorbed sin was considered spiritually dangerous. They were not welcomed in the church, in most accounts, because their accumulated spiritual burden made their presence uncomfortable to communities that took the theology seriously. They lived alone, almost always, a cottage at the edge of the settlement, at enough distance that daily contact could be easily avoided. Children were specifically taught to keep away from them, not out of personal cruelty, but because the sin eater's spiritual contamination was considered transmissible through proximity. And yet, when someone died, the family sent for him immediately. They needed him. They had always needed him. They knew exactly where to find him, because the community had ensured he had nowhere else to go. He was paid. Always. 6 pence was the standard, a small but real acknowledgement that a transaction had taken place. But the payment was never warmth. It was never friendship. It was a fee that completed the exchange and confirmed that once he walked out that door, the social distance between them would resume exactly as before, as if the ritual had never happened. Some accounts describe families leaving the payment on the doorstep rather than placing it directly in his hand, to avoid even brief physical contact once the necessary part was done. There was no retirement from this role. A sin eater remained a sin eater until they died. There was no ceremony that reversed it, no community process for rehabilitation, no path back into ordinary life once the first plate had been eaten. The accumulated sins of everyone they had ever consumed stayed with them, theologically speaking, building over a lifetime of service into a weight that the community believed was genuinely, cosmically real, which created a question that the ritual itself never fully answered. When the sin eater finally died, who ate for them? In most documented cases, the answer was nobody. Some accounts suggest that other sin eaters in a region would eat for one another, a grim professional courtesy. In other cases, the community simply buried the sin eater quickly and quietly, without the ritual, without a priest, sometimes without a marked grave. The person who had spent their entire life absorbing everyone else's spiritual debt died, carrying it all. And the community that had relied on them every single time turned away one final time. But the most unsettling part of this story isn't the ritual itself. It's why someone accepted the job in the first place, and what that tells us about what choices actually look like when you have none. Here is the part nobody in the community ever said out loud. Nobody was born wanting to be the sin eater. People became sin eaters because they had run out of other options. The historical record, thin as it is on this subject, consistently suggests that the people who took on this role were already at the margins of their communities before the role found them. The desperately poor, the already ostracized, the person who had arrived from elsewhere and never fully integrated, the one who had already lost their social standing through some earlier misfortune and had nothing left to protect. For someone in that position, the calculus was brutal but legible. Accepting the role meant permanent social exclusion, but permanent social exclusion was already close to their reality. It meant living alone at the edge of the village, but they may have already been living that way. What it offered, in exchange, was a steady trickle of income that required no employer to approve of you, no community goodwill to access, no social standing to maintain. Every death in the parish was work, and in a pre-industrial rural community, people died with reliable frequency. For someone with nothing, that was a form of security. The community understood this dynamic implicitly, even if it never acknowledged it directly. It needed the sin eater to be desperate enough to say yes, so it created and maintained conditions that ensured someone always would be. By excluding the sin eater so thoroughly from normal economic life, the community guaranteed that the role would always be filled by someone who had no better choice. The ritual solved a theological problem. The social exclusion solved a labor supply problem. Both were functioning exactly as designed. There is something deeply uncomfortable about recognizing that this system was not cruel by accident. It was efficient by design. The community outsourced its spiritual anxiety to the most economically vulnerable person available, paid the minimum necessary to secure the service, and maintained the conditions that ensured a replacement would always be ready. The sin eater was not a victim of ignorance. He was a product of a system that understood exactly what it was doing and chose to keep doing it because it worked. And every time a family sent for him in the middle of the night, relieved and grateful that he existed, they participated in maintaining the exact conditions that had made him available. Not because they were monsters, but because the system made it easy to need him and hard to see what that need was actually costing. We don't do this anymore. Not the ritual itself, but the structure underneath it is not as gone as we might like to believe. Think about every job that society simultaneously needs, pays as little as possible for, and quietly looks down on the people who do it. Garbage collection, slaughterhouse work, prison labor, the care of the dying in underfunded facilities. Jobs that require someone to absorb something the rest of us don't want to deal with directly, whether that's filth, violence, death, or simply the parts of daily life that are unpleasant to think about. We don't outcast those workers the way the sin eater was cast out. The exclusion is subtler now. It looks like low wages that make other options inaccessible, housing in the parts of the city nobody else wants, and working hours that don't leave room for the social life that builds community. We don't send them to live at the edge of the village. We just build the edge of the village wherever they can afford to live. The sin eater's community was honest about the transaction in a way that made it visible, even grotesque. They knew exactly what they were asking someone to carry, they knew exactly what it cost that person, and they built the payment and the exclusion right into the structure of the ritual, openly and consistently. We've made it harder to see. The person absorbing what we'd rather not deal with is further away now, in a different city, a different country, a different supply chain. Somewhere the distance makes it easy not to follow the transaction to its end. Before you feel too comfortable with that distance, ask yourself this. Every modern comfort and system that runs on someone else absorbing something you don't want to touch, does the distance actually make it different, or does it just make it easier to be the family that closes the door without looking back? The sin eater disappeared when the theology that created him stopped being practiced. But the need he answered didn't disappear. We just stopped naming the role. Here is what I want to know from you. Is there a job you rely on today that you think fits this pattern? Necessary, underpaid, and kept invisible on purpose? Name it in the comments. This is just one job. Society built on someone else's willingness to have no choice. There are more of them waiting. You already know where to find them.